Just so you know, I am staring at my son James here. That is the sweetest possible thing to put me in a great mood because he is now doing very well. He's all set, in fact, and they won that game 19-0, as he would want me to say here. There are so many ways in which that was a wonderful introduction, and it is so much better than the one I once got, which began, and now for the latest dope from Washington, here's E.J. Dionne. So I really thank you for that. And I do not want you today to think of me as an inside the Beltway pundit. I want you to think of me as someone from Kevin Durant's hometown. And the other thing I want to say is I want to salute the extraordinary courage of this group for inviting a member of the most beleaguered and despised group in the United States. I am a proud and unapologetic New England Patriots fan. So and I think this is a group that has an unusual interest in economics. So I think the whole country should be grateful to the Patriots for giving the concept of deflation a much deeper and more profound meaning. And it was so sweet of Ed to talk about that. And I am here because I do honor the work of this organization very much. And in an age when we can't even agree anymore on what the facts are, it's actually a blessing to have groups in your state, and there are still some left in our nation, that actually care about the numbers, actually do the math right, actually whatever their argument is when they put out information, you know it's true. And then you can have an argument from there. Democracy is about arguments. In fact, when I get nasty emails or tweets from readers, I will sometimes say that disagreement is one of the joys of freedom, which they agree upon. And they're not always persuaded, however. My favorite, you may think that we Washington columnists are full of ourselves, and we work pretty hard at making people feel that way about us. But we are kept humble by our readers, and I once got an email that began, helpfully it was polite at the beginning, "Dear Mr. Dionne, are you as dumb in person?" And I share that with you only because whatever else you get out of my talk, you will at least be able to answer that question for yourself. So, but Ann Clore and Walt Duncan were just amazing that day. I mean, if you can imagine two parents sitting down in Bethesda, Maryland, our son, you get that call from your son or daughter, or in our case, our son, I'm in the hospital. Those are, about the worst calls you can get from one of your kids. And they just stuck with him all night long in a very difficult circumstance. They stopped on the way back to Boston to make sure he could get some painkillers, which he badly needed. Their generosity was extraordinary. And as I said earlier to some folks, people who care a lot about public policy, it is often said of them that, well, that guy loves humanity. It's human beings he can't stand. Ann and Walt really care about individual human beings, and they are, above all, why I'm so happy to be here today, and bless them, and I thank them so much. And by the way, I just sort of made a list of all of the causes that Ann Clore has been involved in, from the United Way to the Oklahoma, the Medical Research Foundation, the Oklahoma City Memorial, the Junior League, the Girl Scouts, all of that. And there must be some Pro Bowl or MVP award for people who do as much civic work as you do. But I think Oklahoma would be much the poorer without you. And lastly, I salute the Duncans for having excellent taste in the name of their son, our two Jameses. I was going to say this later in my talk, but since we are talking about family, it's something that came up in the conversation this morning that I feel passionately about. And I'm going to talk about the ways in which we are terribly polarized in the country right now, and that we could be looking toward a year in Washington, alas, where some of that comes out often. There is one national conversation that I hope we can have where we can reach across some of these divides, and that is the conversation about family and the role of families in actually being forces that can battle against some of the inequalities in our country rather than forces operating to deepen our inequalities. Bob Putnam, the researcher many of you know, best-selling, he's a Harvard professor. His most famous book is Bowling Alone. Actually, my friend Peter Pierce from Bethany, where are you, Peter? We met in a Bob Putnam seminar many years ago. The proprietor of, what is it, the Bethany Community Bank it is? First Bethany Bank. We could have a whole conversation about community banks, but I'll let Peter do that. But Bob Putnam is writing a book, finishing a book that's coming out in April called Our Children, not their children, our children. And he's talking about all of the children in the United States and asking us to think of all kids as our children. And one of the things he talks about in his book is, can we be candid as a country about seeing that, yeah, there's a red problem and a blue problem? And that the conservative side of this debate is not wrong in saying that family structure matters. They're not wrong in saying that family circumstances really do have a lot to do with the chances that kids are going to have to rise up and be self-sufficient. To say such a thing is not to be bashing single moms. To say such a thing is not to bash people who are gay and lesbian. Indeed, I'd like to see the gay marriage movement become part of a larger movement to say, how can we strengthen marriage in the country as a whole? And so it's not about any of those things, but it is true, and I think many of us have seen in our own lives, it's really hard to argue that two people are better than one in this business, and there's a lot of social science data on this. However, there is also a blue problem, because if family structure has a lot to do with the chance kids have in life, the economy has a lot to do with family formation and putting an awful lot of pressure on families that sometimes is very hard to withstand. Marriage is almost becoming a class privilege in America, and that if you look at the numbers, again, on marriage and intact families, wealthier Americans, upper middle class Americans and above, have a better shot at having intact families than our brothers and sisters who are less well off. The decline of well-paying blue-collar work has something to do with that. The growing economic inequality in the country has something to do with that. And so I know this group has always had the capacity to bring together people. I was at a breakfast where we had business and labor, Republicans and Democrats, I do hope that there can be a conversation that goes way to the right and way to the left, because I think there are a lot of different ideas that can be contributed to this dialogue, and I just hope this is one issue on which we can avoid our usual culture wars. I have to say I am not terribly optimistic. I know we are the way we are these days, but if anybody can do it, Oklahoma can do it. So you can be a model for our country in this, and I want to urge that upon you. A couple of things I want to say just about the state of politics in our country. One thing I am very worried about is that we seem to be creating a kind of split-level political system. Split level in the sense that turnouts in presidential elections are so different than turnouts in midterm elections that we may be voting our way to permanent gridlock. Now, four elections don't necessarily make a pattern. I've always wondered which way you should do it. The plural of anecdote is not data, although in some ways it is. What you've seen, because of the nature of the Democratic coalition now, where Democrats depend a lot on voters under 30 or under 35, depend a lot on Latino voters, who tend to turn out much more in presidential elections than midterm elections. You have a very different electorate in a presidential year. And if you simply project current demographics, you see all things being equal, which they aren't always in politics. You are more likely to see ongoing Democratic majorities in presidential races than not. You are likely to see the Democratic majority grow a little bit every year. I'm not talking about in any given election. I'm talking about the sort of what lies underneath, because the electorate is getting more diverse, and because the younger generation is both more liberal and more democratic than the generation over the age of 65. At the same time, you see radically different turnouts in the midterm elections, where they are dominated by older voters. The younger voters stay home or aren't registered, and it is a much more conservative electorate. You saw this first in the elections of 2010. If you just compare the two elections, in 2008, the electorate was 18% under 30, 16% over 60. In 2010, it was 11% under 30 and 23% over 60. I mean, this is a very different electorate. And now I think this poses real challenges to both our political parties. Democrats, I don't think could survive well if they keep losing midterm elections by these kinds of numbers, because, as you know, most of our states elect their state governments, particularly their governors, in the midterm years. They elect legislatures that draw future district lines, which can have a very important effect on representation. We see that particularly in states in the Midwest, where the votes for Congress are not matched at all by the representation in Congress. And at the federal level, it produces divided government that makes things very difficult. I think on the Republican side, the challenge is, if you don't have more appeal to younger voters and an appeal to a more diverse group of voters, it is going to be very hard for Republicans to win presidential elections in the future. But I think we need to gird ourselves to some degree for this kind of split-level politics. Second thing I want to just talk briefly about is what we might face in Washington in the coming year over budgets. There's a very nice paragraph in the New York Times budget story today that I'll draw from that just tells us how many opportunities we are going to have a crisis over the next, I wish I could say how many opportunities we will have to solve the big national problems facing this great nation of ours. But how many opportunities will we have to face a crisis? Well, as you know, how Republicans are upset with President Obama's executive orders on immigration. And so funding for the Department of Homeland, so they have sort of let funding for the Department of Homeland Security sit there. That deadline is February 28th. Medicare, they have never found a permanent fix for how we pay doctors under Medicare, so that expires all the time. It's terrible to have public policy. It's always thrown around in Washington as the doc fix. Why do we build into our law something where you need a patch every several years? But we have done that for a long time. So that comes up on March 31st. The Highway Trust Fund runs out of money on May 31st. The debt ceiling comes due sometime this summer and fall. And sequester comes back on October 1st. So boy, do we have many opportunities to fight. If we were boxing fans, we'd be very excited about the coming year in Congress. Now, where might we have some agreement and where might we have disagreement? Let me first look at the Affordable Care Act, AKA Obamacare. I think there was actually some very important news this week from Indiana, a very conservative state with a conservative governor who might actually want to run for president of the United States, Mike Pence. And they arranged their own version of the Medicaid expansion. There are aspects of that that many advocates of low-income people are not entirely comfortable with. That would include me. I think there are some fees charged that don't make sense, some services they might be keeping out. Nonetheless, Indiana will be covering a whole lot more of its low-income people through the Affordable Care Act. And you wonder, will this potentially become a model that other more conservative states that have not done the Medicaid expansion, that they might look at and say, okay, let's do this. Without being an interloper meddling in your affairs, I really do not understand refusing the Medicaid money. I just don't. There isn't much free federal money these days. There really isn't. And, and if you don't really care about giving poor people a chance to have insurance, this is enormously helpful to hospitals in every state of the union. I think those of you involved with hospitals know that this puts a lot of pressure on hospitals, particularly in smaller, rural, poor communities in Oklahoma and around the country. And I hope that someday Obamacare, I always thought it was a mistake to call it that, because I thought, I think I understand where the president's approval numbers are in Oklahoma. This isn't about care for Obama. It's about care for Oklahomans and Massachusettsans and Massachusettsites. Let's sort of get on with the job. And I think there are a lot of ways you could fix Obamacare to make it better. And I don't know how many elections it's going to take for us finally to get past this first round of big argument and say, okay, we're going to do this. We didn't have fights like this over the prescription drug benefit expansion under President Bush. We really didn't have fights like this over Medicare. This is actually a narrower program in certain ways than Medicare was. But okay, there are real differences in our country. I hope someday we can get past this and just try to go about the job of getting people health insurance. One area I am very hopeful, and your governor raised this as one of her objectives, is sentencing reform. And sentencing reform really matters to low-income people. There are a lot of families that are in much worse shape, and that we have a pattern in our country where people go back to prison after they're there for a long time. We have wildly unequal penalties depending on the crime, and many of those penalties end up being discriminatory by race. But I think a lot of conservatives around the country are also joining this effort because they look at their state budgets and say, what is the biggest expenditure in our budget? And state after state finds itself spending almost as much as, or in a few cases more, on prisons than on education. Now that really seems to have the priorities backwards. There's an old Jesse Jackson line I always like, better child care and education care on the front end than prison care on the back end. And I think that's an insight that crosses parties. And there are a lot of libertarians who know that some of these penalties are draconian and unfair. So I do hope that, again, we find a little oasis of agreement where we do something on that. Then there's a whole series, then there's just infrastructure, ugly word. I love the Whigs in the 19th century who used to refer to it as internal improvements. That's a much nicer way to refer to it. I wrote a book that I'll allude to later or mention later where I actually spent a lot of time on the American Whigs. And I have a lot of affection for the Whigs. And in the course of doing it, some of you know I argue politics with my friend David Brooks on National Public Radio every week. God bless all your NPR affiliates out here. Many of you know that one of the many interesting things about David is he always seems a little crosswise with politics. And I told him when I finished my book, I said, I am so glad I wrote this book because I finally found out why you are crosswise to American politics. You are the last surviving down-the-line American Whig. And if you actually analyze David's politics, he is a kind of Henry Clay, Abe Lincoln sort of guy. Whether you call it internal improvements or infrastructure, we're behind on this as a country. And I'm not just talking about any particular state. And to me, it's crazy we didn't do more about this when interest rates were at 1% or below, but we still need work in this area. Steve LaTourette, a very interesting kind of moderate conservative Republican from Ohio, retired. And I asked him once, why did you leave? And he said, I left Congress because we can't even pass a transportation bill anymore. That used to be easy. So I think, but that's an area where maybe we can find some accord. Community colleges, for those of you who read my column, I wrote recently on my love for community colleges. My late mom was on the board of our local community college in Fall River, Massachusetts. It's a factory town that I grew up in 50 miles south of Boston. And I saw with my own eyes the opportunities these colleges gave to kids and adults in my hometown who would never otherwise have a chance at higher education. And I know folks in traditional colleges and liberal arts colleges, I surely am not dissing them. But there are particular advantages that community colleges have for low-income folks. And I spoke at the graduation of the community college in our hometown. And every year the president asks the people in the audience who are getting degrees, how many of you are the first in your families to go to college? And like 80% of the hands go up. How many of you worked while you were here at the community college? Again, 80% of the hands grow up. I gave a talk there once and they sent me a check and I wrote my mom, I said, you're on the board, this sounds corrupt to me, let me send the check back. And I sent it to the president and I said, please just split this up to people where it would really matter and help them. And I got the most wonderful letters from the two people they split the money between, including a single mom who had 3 kids, who, thanks to the community college, was going to be able to become a dental hygienist, which would pay her enough money to raise her kids in dignity. Those are opportunities we have all over the country. A lot of Republican governors have been putting money into community college. Tennessee has a plan to make it universal. I think Tulsa, I was told last night, has universal free. I've learned a lot about Oklahoma, by the way, in the last 12 hours. I am your typical journalist who, within 12 hours, considers himself an absolute expert on things. And I can even throw around sort of popular wisdom, as I learned last night of the new school board advice from a school district superintendent to another educator saying, buy your car in the district and your liquor outside the district. I thought, that's a wise man. I want to meet that man. I hope we can find some agreement on community colleges as a country. You look at President Obama's program, again, I'm not sure these things are going to happen, but paid sick leave, Lord knows every American ought to have paid sick leave. Child care. Again, and your state is a pioneer in early childhood education. My colleague Bill Gormley at Georgetown University has done some great studies showing how much your state has done in this area. So we and the rest of the country have a lot to learn from you. But again, if we want people to be self-sufficient, if we want people to work and support themselves, then we have to make it possible for them to earn a living, to make enough to earn a living. Minimum wage is part of that. Yeah, earned income tax credit is part of that. But also to be able to take care of their kids. Some of you know the progressive evangelical leader Jim Wallace, and it was in the time when we were talking a lot about soccer moms, and I love soccer moms. I mean, in presidential politics, he invented another group called Burger King Mom. And Burger King Mom was a woman he met at a Burger King who had her 2 kids with her, and they were sitting behind the counter doing their homework, and he asked her, "What are your kids doing there?" And she said it was the only place they were safe, and I wanted to keep an eye on them. So we got to think about soccer moms, but we got to think about Burger King Mom as well. The area where we're going to fight, unfortunately, I think, is the area where we have always had divisions, have had divisions for a long time, and that's how to pay for things. And what the president announced, the administration announced that it is going to try to get rid of the sequester. It's going to say that it wants to spend some money on these various priorities, and it also wants to relieve the sequester on defense spending, which is quite popular among a lot of Republicans, but that we're going to have to figure out how to pay for it. And the president's going to have a significant amount of revenue in his budget, otherwise known as taxes. And I think there's going to be a lot of fighting about that. And then I think the question, this time, I think the fairness issue will be joined more clearly because so many of the increases actually are on very wealthy people, notably the proposal to tax capital gains at death. And I hope we have a real debate about that. I think the Republicans on these things are going to be split into 3 camps. I think there are kind of Rand Paul-style libertarians who'd actually be happy to see both the defense cuts and the domestic cuts go through. I think there are defense hawks like Senator McCain who are going to really fight the defense sequester and might make accommodations on other questions. And I think there are going to be Republicans who want to sort of get rid of the defense sequester but pay for it by cutting domestic spending. But domestic spending right now in the United States, if you put aside Medicare and Medicaid and and the entitlements, is about as low as it's been in probably since Eisenhower. And by the way, that includes Homeland Security, that includes veterans. So I think that is where the rubber is going to meet the road. To me, we would have a better political conversation if we did a couple of things. One, I would like us to stop talking about big or small government and just ask us what do we want government to do. 2 great political scientists, called Free and Cantrill, once noted that Americans were ideological conservatives and operational liberals. They didn't like government in the abstract, but they actually liked a lot of the stuff government did. And so I think we should begin with the question, not is government in the abstract a bad thing? We are a free country. We have a free Republican government of a Republican form that is broadly democratic. We should be proud of that. Let's figure out what we want that government to do. So I would like to see if we could argue about it that way. Let us argue more about how to reform government. I know you raised the issue of voting problems we have in America. I am the only speaker you will ever hear, I betcha, to quote Sarah Palin. I also liked her line about the hopey-changey thing. I also like the hopey-changey thing. Who actually believes in compulsory voting, which is to say compulsory attendance at the polls. You can draw a Mickey Mouse on your ballot. They do it in Australia. I'm for this for 2 reasons. I actually think there is a civic obligation to vote, but also this would wonderfully reverse the assumption. Right now, governments all over the United States make it harder for people to vote, make it especially hard for minorities to vote, make it especially hard for young people to vote. If everybody had to vote, then the government's obligation is to open the way so everybody can carry out their obligation as citizens. I guarantee you this proposal will go nowhere, but I never tire of talking about it. I know about 3 other people who support it. They are all my colleagues at the Brookings Institution. But just take a look at Australia. But it's not just voting, and it's not just campaign money that needs to be reformed. I'd also like to see a system where there is a match for small donations to create much stronger incentives to give small contributions. I'd like to see Citizens United fall. I think it is one of the worst decisions the court has made. But even with Citizens United, there are things we can do to try to change the incentives in the money system. And I would like to see that. But I also think that for those of us who are liberal or progressive, and I answer to both of those, we have a responsibility to make government work. We have more of a responsibility to make government work in some ways than our conservative friends do. And I say that with respect to my conservative friends, because we are the people who says government can do good things. And if we're going to go out there time after time and tell people we believe government can do good, then we should want the government to work better. We should want people's experiences with government to be good. We should figure out better ways. The federal government has a crazy hiring system that needs to be reformed. We should make it more attractive for young people to go into public service in government. I teach at a public policy school. And many of the kids at public policy schools don't want to go into government. They want to go into not-for-profits. And we all are here and know how great not-for-profits are. But we really need good people working in our government. And it doesn't have to be a whole life commitment. I think we should make it easier for people to go in and out of government. So it's another thing you could maybe do out here in the state of Oklahoma. That could be another model for us, which is for people on the broadly moderate and progressive side of Oklahoma politics to cooperate with conservatives to say, how can we make government work better? Because if you are a conservative, if you're a business person applying for a permit, you sure don't have an interest in slow and incompetent government. And so let's make that work better. And we got to deal with the growing inequality, wage stagnation, and I think this is, again, not just a problem of economics, it's a problem for democracy itself. And it's not just an American problem. If you look at Europe with the rise of some really quite extreme parties, particularly on the right, where does that come from? It comes in significant part because people don't think the social bargain they thought they had. You work hard, you get a chance to retire, your kids have a chance to rise up. If we start breaking that bargain with people, people are going to start losing faith in the whole system. They're going to start losing faith in the market system, and they're going to start losing faith in the democratic system. And we've been there before in the 1930s. There were a lot of people in the world who said that these dictatorships govern themselves much more efficiently than those democracies. Now, thank goodness FDR and a lot of other leaders in the democracies proved them wrong, and Winston Churchill too. We need to prove them wrong again, but we'll only prove them wrong if we make this system more just and more fair. So I want to just close on this. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Our Divided Political Heart. You know, one of the things I love about America is how completely contradictory and complicated we are as a country. And just think about our culture. Is our country better personified by the community spirit of Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life? I am such a sucker. It is one of my favorite movies. Or by the rogue individualism of Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry. It's a Wonderful Life or Dirty Harry. Does Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land or Frank Sinatra's My Way speak more directly to the American character? Are we about the solidarity of Steinbeck or the individualism of On the Road? Who are we? Well, the argument in my book is actually we're both of these things. That from the beginning, America has been torn by a deep but healthy tension between our love of individualism and our affection for community. And too often, I think we've been told only one side of this story on the individualistic side, or we have been told that you have to pick between the two. But we Americans have never chosen to pick between the two. We have always tried to keep these in balance. I think we have not focused enough on how the liberty we prize depends upon our willingness to come to the defense of each other's liberty, and how liberty depends on strong communities, energetic government, and a concern for the common good. Love to ask this question to every audience I speak to. What is the first word of the Constitution of the United States? Yes, everybody say it. We. I love to ask crowds say that because as Americans, we don't say that word much anymore. And I always like to read the preamble, which in some ways is my favorite part of the Constitution. We have let the preamble go as a serious business, and yet it really tells us what our government's for. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare. Yes, welfare is right there in the first paragraph of the Constitution of the United States. And secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. Again, ourselves and our posterity, not just me, do ordain and establish this Constitution. And our Declaration has the same sort of double message in it. It talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but right at the end, the framers pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. So they are willing to work together and to give up a lot in order to achieve these common goals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I could give you a whole tour of American history on this, but there's only one I want to mention before I close. When do you think the first version of socialized medicine was ever established in the United States of America? And I didn't know this until I wrote this book and was doing research. President John Adams signed into law in 1798 a bill creating the Marine Hospital Service, which funded hospitals across the country to treat sailors who were sick or injured on the job. Now, I don't know what kind of lobby they had. I don't know how afraid they were. But there is no record of mass campaigns to repeal Adams Care. And I just have to share with you one of the more embarrassing moments in my career of talking to people. For that book, I got to go on Jon Stewart. And I took my kids there because it was the first time their dad had done something really cool. I was on Jon Stewart. When I was talking about this law with Jon Stewart, I very innocently referred to sick and injured seamen. You can only imagine what Jon Stewart did with that. And so I've stuck to sailors ever since. My friend Paul Begala wrote something nice about my book, and he said something about Texas that I think is also true of Oklahoma and large parts of our country. There were two kind of arguments from politicians that they can always make. You know, one version goes, you know, when we came here, we built this ourselves. Nobody gave us a handout. We built our farms and we built our ranches and we worked really hard and we accomplished something. And that's part of the story. And the other part is when we came here, we came in wagon trains and we protected each other. And when we came here, one of the first things we did was build schools, so all the kids in our community could get educated. We built churches so all of us together could worship God. I think these are the two sides of our story. So the very last thing I want to say is I want to convince you that Bruce Springsteen has a lot in common with our Puritan fathers. Now, how many Springsteen fans are there? I've learned about pandering in Washington. There are few things better than to pander by way of Bruce Springsteen. But for those of you who are true Springsteen fans, you will remember his album of a couple years ago where the refrain of the lead song is, "Wherever this flag is flown, we take care of our own." And I love that song, and I love that idea. And in fact, that idea is very similar to John Winthrop when he established, in the very early Puritan settlements in Massachusetts, he gave a sermon called, which was called A Model of Christian Charity. And I'll just read one passage from it. He said, "We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our community as members of the same body." Yes, I think Bruce and John Winthrop have a lot in common. Both understood some of the very best aspects of what makes us Americans. And I think we'll honor our past, build a more secure and just future by remembering, as they do, that building a nation and a state where liberty thrives requires us to stand with each other and make each other's conditions our own. I hope we can join together again in the spirit of John Winthrop and Bruce Springsteen, remembering that it is our commitment to the well-being of each other that is one of the very best things about being an American. Thank you very much. Thank you. We got some time for Q&A. No, the story I like to tell is my dear Uncle Ray and I argued, ardent Republican, he argued politics all well, not all his life because he's older, but for a long time, for about 35 years. And when he passed away, his kids asked me to do the eulogy, and they knew how much I loved him. And I made a point of quoting Richard Nixon in my eulogy. And it was actually a Nixon line he liked to quote the Teddy Roosevelt line about the man in the arena. But I looked at the folks in the church and I said, I also quoted that because I was just hoping that if Uncle Ray heard me quote Richard Nixon, he'd rise out of that coffin just to tell me, I knew you'd be quoting Nixon someday. So please, sir.
Your colleague at Brookings, Ron Haskins,
yes.
Wrote an interesting piece in the Times a couple of weeks ago about funding programs that work.
Yes.
And I'm curious about how you view that movement versus and what the impact could be on formula funding that flows from the feds down to the states and the local municipalities.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad you asked that question. Ron, by the way, is Brookings. A lot of people call it the liberal Brookings Institution. Ron is actually a Republican, was a staffer on Ways and Means who passed the welfare reform bill, and he gives me grief for all the things I wrote critical of that welfare reform bill, and he's also an absolutely wonderful person. And I agree very much with that piece, and in fact, I don't agree with Paul Ryan on too many things, but he and Patty Murray introduced a bill, Senator Patty Murray of Washington, introduced a bill to create a commission to figure out how we can have more evidence-based policy. And I believe, from what I know, that President Obama is going to actually embrace some of that next week, where I do think that we have more capacity than ever to know what works and what doesn't. Now, social policy is not science in the way a chemical reaction is science, because human beings are human beings. My favorite line on human beings is Reinhold Niebuhr, who once said, original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian church. Niebuhr is one of my heroes, the Christian theologian. So it can't be perfect, but we ought not to spend money on stuff that doesn't work. And I do think, again, just as I think certain aspects of government reform ought to bring us together across these lines, I think we really want to figure out what works. And then, you can give state governments more flexibility to take federal money and spend it in ways that work. If they can prove that this way of doing it's going to work better here than that way of doing it. So I'm very sympathetic to that. And again, with Ryan and Murray on the same side and Obama, maybe we'll get somewhere. But I think it's something that I personally think is very hard to oppose. But I've been surprised before at what people found their way toward opposing. So I'm very much with my friend Ron on that. Who's got the, thank you. Who is, if you're not careful, I'll start telling Louisiana political jokes, one of my favorite topics, or even Massachusetts political jokes. Sir?
With the recent election of the Koch brothers Senate, how do you think that will affect the upcoming presidential election?
Wait, say the beginning again, I'm sorry.
With the recent election of the Koch brothers in the United States Senate, how do you think that will affect the pending presidential election?
Yeah, the Koch brothers announced they intend to make a rather significant, shall we say, investment in the next election. They are saying that they can raise and spend $889 million. I saw that and said, oh, guys, why didn't you go for the full billion? What the heck? It's not clear to me what the answer to that question is. On the one hand, they are becoming much more open about what they are up to. They had their little cattle call for some of the candidates over the weekend, and they actually broadcast some of it. There's David Frum. I don't know how many of you ever read David. He's a very interesting conservative. He was actually a speechwriter for President George W. Bush. But he has referred to a group. He's a conservative, but is upset about some of the directions of conservatism, and has spoken about a group called the Radical Rich and their influence on our politics. And I have to say, I have been astonished, and David wrote about this, that when you saw Wall Street folks who had made a whole lot of money saying that we were rapidly moving towards socialism. If I look at the stock market and look at that statement, Barack Obama is the most incompetent socialist since Karl Marx first wrote the Communist Manifesto. And so I don't get, that radicalism, but I think it has had an influence on the direction of the Republican Party. And I think the party has become more ideological. And back in the day when the Kochs were primarily interested in sort of changing the intellectual conversation, we're giving a lot of money to the Cato Institute and the like, I found that more congenial, but probably because they weren't throwing all their money in political campaigns. But I find it very disturbing because I don't think that kind of more radical libertarian-style conservatism works for us. I don't think we want it. And I think conservatives have gone through a cycle where they are promised a size of government. We're going to really get rid of this government. And it's impossible to achieve it because Americans actually on the other side, whatever they may say about how much they hate government, want government to do a lot of things. And so I think you've had a cycle of disappointment and even a feeling of betrayal on the right that I think sort of more radical conservatism only feeds. I would like a more Burkean kind of conservatism, battling a sensible sort of John Dewey liberalism or social democracy, and then we could have sort of an argument where we might sort of find a little more common ground. So that's my take on them. But I think, in terms of the practical effect, I am not sure yet. It probably helps Scott Walker a little bit. It probably helps Marco Rubio, apparently, who won the Koch straw poll, it looks like. But that's about as far as I can go on that right now. Although all pundits go way beyond their personal knowledge, but I just don't think I should. Go ahead, please.
Mr. Dionne, how do you assess the deep hostility and animosity that has been expressed toward President Obama since he came into office across the political spectrum, across the spectrum of evangelical Christianity? As a retired clergy, I experienced...
Do you mind if I ask what tradition you're
United Methodist.
Uh-huh.
I see on the internet, these wild predictions of what's going to happen. They're coming after us, and they're going to take our guns and they're going to put us in camps, the FEMA camps. And those. What is the core of that? And I think there's an obvious answer, and there are probably some other answers.
Yeah, I mean, what you are politely asking is it President Obama's race that's at the bottom of all of this. And I have a couple of views on that. View number one is it is undeniable that some significant piece of this opposition is about race, and you can see that in what they have accused, quotes, President Obama of. What is accusing him, in quotes, of having been born in Kenya, not the United States? That sure seems to have something to do with race. He's a Muslim, not a Christian. That's a piece of it. There was even one poll that showed 6% of us said he couldn't be president because he was born in Hawaii. I like to think that's the pollsters' problem, but not the. The Muslim charge is connected to race. The New York Times had a very interesting map after the 2008 election that showed in 78% of the American counties, President Obama ran ahead of John Kerry from the previous 4 years. In about 15% of the counties, or 22%, President Obama ran behind John Kerry. And the counties tended to be within a swath that ran from kind of western Pennsylvania through Appalachia down through parts of the South. Obama ran behind Kerry, for example, among whites in Alabama. Now, neither of them did very well. Most of the whites in Alabama were voting conservative, period, in both elections. So can you say this is all about race? No, it's not all about race. For goodness sake, the Republican Congress, we forget, impeached Bill Clinton. There was a lot of opposition to people seen as liberal. Even though Bill Clinton wasn't all that liberal, and I actually don't think Barack Obama's all that liberal either. So I think race is a piece of it. But I think there are plenty of conservatives who are just opposed to his policies for reasons that have nothing to do with race. And as I say, they were against Clinton, they were against Kerry, and that's an awful lot of people. The third thing I'd say is when we get into this, what I think of as a silly argument, the silly argument being, no, it's not about race. Yes, it's all about race. Well, no, of course, it's a lot of it. There's a lot of race and there's a lot of other stuff. We forget how much race had to do with the realignment of American politics. Beginning in the 1940s, and especially after the 1960s, go see the movie Selma, we had a political realignment in our country where a lot of white folks, particularly in the South, realigned toward conservatism. So race plays a part in American politics even when President Obama isn't there. The final thing I want to say is some of it really is strange and ugly to me, particularly strange and ugly. But then we're a country that has produced some pretty awful accusations against other leaders, particularly visionary ones, particularly Lincoln and Jefferson and Roosevelt. So I suppose if the president ever gets bothered by this, maybe he can just take it as a compliment. But thank you for the question. Yeah, two more? Yeah,
Hi.
please.
Thank you for coming. How much, our politics has always been yelling at each other and it's always been messy, but how much influence do you think that Fox has had in making us polarized? Influence of Fox News in making us polarized? Worse? Or is it just always been this way?
No, I think that Fox has, there's no question that Fox has had an effect. It's how some of their tropes entered the mainstream conversation, like Barack Obama went to a madrasa. No, Barack Obama didn't go to a madrasa, but that entered the conversation. Some colleagues and I did a poll where if you look at Republicans who watch Fox News are much more conservative than Republicans who don't. Now, they're both conservative. The Republican Party is a conservative party now, but for example, non-Fox, one of the things I remember, Fox Republicans, majority against increasing the minimum wage. Non-Fox Republicans, a majority for increasing the minimum wage. Fox Republicans more opposed to gay marriage than non-Fox Republicans. So Fox has an effect. But also that's a kind of chicken and egg thing. Is it Fox having that effect, or is it that the most conservative people in the Republican Party watch Fox? But, you know, and there's a lot of talk that we are more in our own individual media silos now. You know, and that can be true of people on the left as well as people on the right. I teach a media and politics class, and I asked my kids, I gave my students a list of conservative websites and asked if they had heard of them, and a few hands went up. And then I asked a series of liberal websites, and a few more hands went up. And then I asked, has anybody heard of both of them? And one hand went up. And I said, oh, that's great. You actually read both sides. And it turned out his job was studying online media for CNN. So that's true. But I think there is, this book I'm writing is about why have you seen this radicalization on the right. I think you've returned on the right to some of the tropes from way back in the 50s and 60s. You know, Glenn Beck recycling old John Birch Society books on the far right as an example of that, which I think puts pressure on Republicans who are moderate conservatives to be more conservative. And I guess that's the main effect, not just of Fox, but of these other outlets. But again, I believe we all should acknowledge sin, and that, you know, there are times when, you know, those of us on the progressive side can live in our own worlds too. But I think there's a particular problem on the far right now. So while I'm willing to be as fair as I can be, I am a progressive, and I do see the problem as bigger on that side. I do. I honestly do. Who's got do we let the host of the show ask the last question? That would be you, David. See, actually, David and I want to talk about Canadian politics. Oh, sir.
Excuse me, I'll take this opportunity. So my question really is, how does an increasing federal deficit get us to the world that you would describe we'd want to be in?
Wait,
the increasing federal deficit, how does that make economic sense to keep increasing the federal deficit and still have a sustainable way to provide the kind of society that you've been speaking about?
Right. Two things. One, in the short run, as you know, the deficit has been going down finally. And I think our conversation on this got skewed because the deficit shot up to stratospheric levels. Why? Well, two things. We had a record economic downturn of a sort not seen since the Great Depression, so we had people not working, which means they weren't paying taxes, plus they were drawing government benefits, less economic activity. On the other side of the ledger, we had the stimulus plan, and I believe not only was the stimulus right to do, I thought it should have been bigger, because I thought the problem was deeper and we needed to give the economy a bigger kick, and we might not have had such a long recovery of the sort, you know, that where wages and the like are sluggish. We can argue about the stimulus if we want, but clearly those were the two big factors, plus the ongoing impact of the tax cuts we passed in the 2000s. So now we are kind of washing that out of the system, and things are getting better. You know, that unemployment is down, use of some of the government benefits is down, the stimulus is no more. And then we've got the long-term deficit. So, the deficit right now as a share of GDP is not alarming. It's 2-something. I think we're below where a lot of countries are. It's the long term when we baby boomers retire. And, that's Social Security and that's Medicare. It's also, by the way, Medicaid. And in fact, the biggest problem is healthcare costs. In other words, I think the biggest divide on this issue is between people who say big general stuff about entitlements, it's an entitlement problem, and those who say, no, it's a healthcare problem. I am on the healthcare problem side, where if we've already had the deficit come down significantly because for a whole variety of reasons, some related to Obamacare, but some related to the recession itself, we've had a real decline in healthcare inflation. If we could keep that on that sort of trajectory, our long-term budget problem would look a lot better. If healthcare costs start climbing again, we have a big problem. So to me, if you care about the long-term deficit, which at some we will have to, we're going to have to figure out how to bring healthcare costs down. And I hope we figure out ways to do that. And the problem is we all want somebody else to pay for the decline in healthcare costs. We want them to have fewer services, or we want them to pay higher copays. We rarely like doing it ourselves, but that's what we're going to have to look at that. But I think mostly we need systematic changes in how we pay doctors, how we pay per disease as opposed to per treatment, that sort of thing. But thank you very much. And again, I just want to thank you all for coming here today, for being so gracious to me. I want to thank the Duncans again for being the best family in Oklahoma. Forgive me, I'm biased. And thank you all for supporting the idea that facts actually matter in public policy. Bless you all.